Hi, so today I'm going to guide you through how you sew up the Torrens box top. So I have all my pieces cut out. I have my back piece, my front piece, my two armbands, and then I have my front and back facing here. I've also already fused some interfacing to my facings here, so that's already done. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the shoulder seams of the garment and of the facings together. So I'm just matching the facings here. Just going to pop a pin in there. And the same on the other side. I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam. Just going to open out my back piece here. And I'm going to place the front piece on top of it, right sides together. So I'm going to pin the shoulder seams, so that's the neck there. I'm going to pin the shoulder seams together. I like to pin each end like this, just in case I have any ease. I'm now going to sew my shoulder seams and my front and back facing seams together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Right, so I have sewn the shoulder seams and those facing seams. I'm going to finish the edges of those shoulder seams with them together, and then I'm going to press them towards the back. I'm also going to press the facing seams open like this, and then I'm going to overlock or zigzag, if you don't have an overlocker, around that edge, so the outside edge, so the larger side of that. So I'll do that and I'll be back. Right, so I've finished the edges of the shoulder seam and the edge of the facing. I also actually went ahead and sewed a label onto my facing, which of course is completely optional. If you're wondering which is the front and which is the back when you sew your label on, if you just match the seams together and lay it down flat, you'll see that the front is lower and it matches with the neckline. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to attach the facing to the front of the garment. I'm just going to trim my threads. Right. So I'm going to identify the front and the back. So the front is lower here, and then the front of my facing and the front is lower on that. I'm going to flip it around so that we're going to go right sides together. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start pinning from my shoulder seam. I'm going to match that as well as I can and pop a pin in. I like to put a pin right at that seam and then check to see if it's good, and it's pretty good. I'm going to match the other shoulder seam. Oops, sorry, I bumped the camera. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the neckline. Now hopefully the neckline of the shirt won't have stretched too much just yet because we've only just started sewing. The facing won't have stretched because it's stabilized with the interfacing. So yeah, so if you need a guide for which is the most accurate, it is going to be the facing. So I'll just continue pinning that. Right, so I'm going to sew the facing to the garment using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I've sewn that seam. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grade and clip this seam allowance. So what that does is it reduces the amount of bulk you have. You can see, for instance, at this shoulder, there's quite a lot of bulk there. This is a very thin fabric, so it's not really the end of the world if I didn't grade it, but it gives a really nice finish if you do it. The clipping part is not optional though. So I'm going to just use my clippers here. You can see that there's 2 layers. There's like the garment and then there's the facing. I'm just going to trim back this facing layer. So this is just called grading the seam. So I'm just going to trim it back like this. If I had duckbill scissors, I would use them, I guess, but I don't have any. So I'm just going to show you what this does. So you can see that it kind of makes different levels. It's kind of like steps going down. So when I turn it through, it's not going to have all of the layers sitting on top of each other, which would create quite a lot of bulk. What I'm going to do at the shoulders, so I'll just grade this side. Just that top layer. You can use scissors. You don't have to use clippers. These clippers are pretty sharp though, so I'm going to use them. In the seam allowances, I have this extra bit, so I'm just going to angle that away a little bit. So I've got lots and lots of kind of steps, different graded layers. Just being really careful not to clip through my part that I've sewn there. Once I've done that all the way around, I'm going to clip the seam. So that is, because it's an inside curve, I can just go through and clip into the seam allowance like that. It helps it sit flat. I'll do it every, centimeter or so, so about every half inch. You need to do it closer where there's a tighter curve, and you can do it further apart where it's less of a curve and you don't have to clip at all if there's no curve. So I'm going to make sure that I do clip right into this shoulder seam here. But just be really careful not to go through your line of stitching there. If the fabric frays very, very easily, then I would clip just a tad further away from the stitching line than I would for something like this, which is fairly stable. So I've graded and clipped that whole seam. The next thing I'm going to do is understitch, and what that does is it just holds that facing and all of the seam allowances underneath, so it's like rolled under. So you can see this is how I sewed it. I'm going to just fold that back. So this is the outside of the shirt and this is the facing. And I'm going to stitch onto the facing, just a pin widths away from that seam allowance, but I'm going to stitch all of this seam allowance towards that facing. If you want to, you can press, but it's not really necessary in this step, and it's not something I say very often. You're just going to kind of feel with your finger and make sure that everything is where you want it to be. So for my machine, I'm just lining up that edge of the presser foot with the seam line, and I'm going to just stitch. So, you know, going around a curve, it's sometimes a little bit tricky. You just have to go slowly. It would be helpful if I had an extension table for this machine, but I don't. So I'm just always feeling on this side to make sure that all of the seam allowances are pushed to the facing side. Also kind of pulling apart a little bit with my hands just to make sure that I'm opening that seam up. So you can see I've understitched that, and what that does is it just encourages the facing to roll down nicely like that. I am now going to press. I'm going to press from the wrong side. I'm going to press that facing down so I get a nice clean edge of that neckline. So the next part is up to you. So we have our neckline sewn now, and it looks pretty good. You know, it's just your decision now whether you're going to top stitch this down with a nice wide top stitch or ditch stitch it down in the shoulder seam. For this particular fabric, I'm actually going to ditch stitch it on the shoulder, so I'll show you that. But you could just as easily top stitch this down. When I top stitch, I always top stitch with a stitch length of 3. And the reason for that is top stitching is decorative, and so you want to see each individual stitch, whereas when I'm doing construction, I would tend to, you know, you want it to be stronger, so I tend to sew it at a 2.5. So if I were top stitching, I would just decide how far I want the top stitching to be away from that edge, and it looks honestly quite nice with a very wide one. So, you know, about there, I would measure it, flip it over. You know, place that here on my sewing machine, and then I'd actually probably put a piece of tape just as a guide here, so to keep that even, and then I would stitch, well, either from the right or the wrong side, it wouldn't matter. I'm not going to do that today because I want to ditch stitch. You know, we don't want our facing flapping around, so the best thing to do is just to catch it down in that shoulder. So I'm just going to make sure my facing is nice and flat. You can pin this, I usually don't, but you can just give it a pin just on the edge there. And I'm gonna just sew just a few stitches. You can sew all the way along, but you don't need to. You just need to grab this, just this ending bit here. I wanna try and match up my stitching lines as much as possible. In an ideal world, you will stitch right on top of your 2 stitching lines. So I wanna stitch right in that stitching line there. So you can see from the right side, you can't really see that at all. So I'm going to do that on the other side as well. Right, so on to the next step. I'm going to sew the armbands to the shirt. And this step is maybe a little confusing. It's different to usual. So I'm going to go ahead and fold my sleeve bands in half with right sides together. And we're going to sew this short seam here. However, what we're going to do is start and finish a 1/2 inch in from the edge. So normally what I do is I just kind of start off by eyeballing a 1/2 inch, and then I take my seam gauge or something else and I measure it to see if I was right, and pretty good. So let's try the other side. Want to really try and be accurate here. So yeah, that's right on a 1/2 inch, which is great. So I'm just going to sew the seam in between these 2 pins. So a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but starting and stopping a 1/2 inch in from those edges. I'm going to do the same on the other sleeve band. So just pin, eye judging that 1/2 inch, checking I was pretty off there. So try again. Whoops, it's not very straight. That's perfect. Good. So I'm going to go ahead and sew those 2 sleeve band seams now. So I have sewn that seam. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press this seam open. So press it open, and I'm going to press it open all the way to the edge. So even though this part isn't sewn, I'm going to press it open as though it was sewn all the way. Right, so I have pressed that open. So now I'm going to fold it together with the wrong sides together, so with that seam matching, and I'm going to fold it into something that looks like an armband. I'm going to press it now. Just want to make sure that this seam is aligned, so I have this kind of V opening here. So I'm going to press it in half, so I have basically like something that looks like a finished armband. So the next step in this process is to apply the armband to the garment. The way we do this is pretty unique to this top. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the V that I have here, just make sure I have it, and I'm going to pin the other side, so the top. So I'm just like creasing that, and I'm just gonna pop a pin in there, just so I know where that side is. So here's my garment. I'm going to start by finding the notch on the garment on the side seam. So there's a notch here for the underarm seam. So I'm going to start by matching that notch. So see the notch? I'm going to match that to the V that I have in my armband here. So I'm going to just match that up right like that. And pop a pin in it. So if you've made garments before, you'll know that this is a pretty weird thing to do, to sew a loop basically to a flat garment. It's pretty weird, but it works, so we're going to do it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find that pin, that center pin, and I'm going to match it to the shoulder seam and pin that together. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the sleeve band to that garment. So I'm essentially matching 3 raw edges together. It shouldn't need any ease because everything's cut on the straight grain, so it should be pretty easy to go. And I'm just going to continue pinning around. So this was that shoulder point. I'm just going to continue pinning around. And then this other V point is going to match up with the notch on the other side, the other underarm notch. So we have our sleeve band and we have our open side seams here, and it's pinned all the way around. And I'm going to show you how we're going to sew that. So I'm going to start sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to start sewing right at that apex. So I'm going to put it in and put my needle down right here and sew a 1/2 inch seam around. So accuracy is pretty key here. Putting my needle down right at that apex. Making sure even when I back tack, I'm not going over that. Now I'm going to sew my 1/2 inch seam. Right, so you can see I'm almost back around at the other side, so I'm just making sure I'm not sewing through too many layers, and I'm going to finish sewing right on that apex. So you can see that I've started and finished right on that apex, and I have still have my side seams open, but I've sewn around that loop. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on the other side now. Our next step is to finish the edges of the side seam. So we have our loop, and that's here. And I'm just tucking that sleeve band to the inside, so it's still right sides together. And then I'm going to go down to the hem edge of either the front or the back. So I'm sewing from the right side. So you could zigzag this, you don't have to overlock it. Just trying to trim off as little as possible. Okay, now you can see that I'm nearing this sleeve band thing. I don't want to sew all of these layers together because then I won't be able to put my arm through it. So when we get to this point, what you're going to do is fold one side of that sleeve band and side seam out of the way and finish this sleeve band and side seam together. I'm just holding that out of the way there. Okay, you can see I've almost reached that loop. So this time I'm going to hold the other side out of the way. So just make sure that you still have an armhole that you can put your arm through. Right, so I still have that sleeve band folded to the inside, and this is that edge I serged just then. So now we need to sew the side seams. So you'll see that's just where that start and stop point was for the loop of the sleeve band. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing my side seam exactly where I finished sewing. So just like before we wanted to start and stop sewing exactly in the apex, for this I want to start and stop sewing exactly where that line of stitching ends. And then I'm going to sew the side seam down to the bottom. So I'm just going to pin it. You can pin it or not. So I'm going to sew essentially the continuation of this, the 1/2 inch seam, all the way down to the bottom hem. Right, so I've sewn that side seam, and let's see what happens. It's going to turn it the right way out. And then we have our sleeve band. You can check the underarm to see if there's a hole or a pucker. We have neither here, so that's good. If there were a tiny hole there, it would just mean that I just need to sew it one more stitch. Or if there were a little pucker, that would mean I had just sewn it and just a little bit too much. Depending on how big that is, you could redo that. So you can see here there's the tiniest of holes. So I will go back and close that up just by sewing one more stitch. I'm going to press my side seam open, and I'm going to continue the pressing all the way up, and what that will do is I will then press the the armhole seam towards the body of the garment. So I'm just going to press that open and then continue pressing that essentially away from the sleeve band. Alright, so I've pressed that. You can see that this unusual sleeve band application gives us this cool right angle for the sleeve band, which I really like. The last step is just to hem it. So at this point, what I would suggest is trying the top on, marking where you want that to hit, and press it up. So you can press maybe a 1/2 inch first, and then for me, I press a 1/2 inch and then 1.5 inches. I've made this top enough times that I know that. Then you can either hand stitch that up. I've got a tutorial on Instagram about how to do that. Or you can just machine it with a top stitch length of 3, and then your top will be done. So I pressed up my hem and I have top stitched it, and now my top is done and it is ready to wear. So I hope you enjoyed making this Torrens box top, and I hope that you enjoy wearing it as much as I do.